All right. So we're actually going to be shifting gears a little bit. Most of us probably don't even remember where we were. This is 3 weeks ago was our last actual class of keeping your kids on God's side. And so we were talking about truth and worldviews, kind of subjective truth, objective truth, kind of going with, just kind of teasing that out. And we're going to be switching gears a little bit today. Thank you for those of you who came to last week's presentation. Hopefully the Israel thing kind of gave you some perspective on what's going on over there. I wasn't even aware that Russ is actually doing his own class on that, but apparently he's doing like a really in-depth history, which he didn't tell me. But so hopefully my brief history gave you some perspective on just some of the conflicting information that's coming out from the conflict that's going on over there. Anyway, we're going to be talking about Jesus today. So these are going to be conversations about Jesus and just different challenges that people bring up, with him, just his existence even. So we're going to start with that. That's actually a challenge that some people bring up. We're going to skip over review, at least for now, just so we can get through all the material. And so my first question is, how do we know that Jesus existed? It sounds kind of weird to us to even imagine that some people would say that he was just a myth, but people do make this claim. And so, morning, Carolyn. Actually, we can probably shut the door. Would you mind shutting the door for me? Okay, very good. But what do you guys think? Like, how do we actually know that he existed? Anybody have any thoughts?
Written sources, I think.
Yeah.
Bible and others.
Right, so we do have the Gospels, right? And I think some people will discredit them because they're biased sources. These are Christians writing about Jesus, so of course they're going to try to say it was true. That in itself is kind of has its own fallacy, but that's a claim that people will make. But I like where you're going because it's documentation, right? So we have documentation from that time that affirms his existence. And so, but before we get into the actual documentation, let's just kind of talk about Dr. Bart Ehrman. Anyone heard about Dr. Bart Ehrman? So he's a relatively, in apologetic circles, so people that kind of discuss like the historicity of Jesus and, different defenses for Christianity, he's a relatively well-known person because what he is, he's an atheist actually. He used to be a Christian, or he was a self-avowed Christian at one time, and then over a period of time he decided he was an atheist, but he affirms, he's a historian, right? And he affirms certain realities about Christianity, one being that he actually existed. Okay, and then secondarily, I believe it's the crucifixion. So we're not going to talk about that today. That's going to be for a future class. But this is what he says about mythicists. So mythicists are people that say that Jesus was just a myth. Okay, he says that mythicists are not influential amongst scholars of antiquity, historians of the ancient world, classicists, and biblical scholars. So basically, no one in the academic world actually accepts the theory that Jesus was just a myth. Historically, it's pretty undeniable that he existed. And so this kind of gives weight to, obviously, our religion to some degree. But we have to address popular claims. So the thing is, even though no one in scholarly circles, no one in academia is saying that Jesus didn't exist, there is a lot of internet, misinformation flying out around there that is saying that he didn't exist. Which, of course, is not substantiated. These are not scholars that are saying this. These are just kids on the internet or just people that are ignorant to the subject that are making these claims. But of course, our kids, when they say, well, did Jesus actually just, they type in Google, these mythicist claims are going to come up and they might be very convincing to them. So we want to kind of know, what academia is saying about the history of Jesus, or what historians are saying about his existence, so that we can kind of just help them to understand that he did actually exist. And so we're going to look at non-Christian sources to start, right? So because when we're looking at historical evidence and we're trying to figure out what's fact from truth, or truth from falsity, a lot of times if our enemies, right? So if people that don't say that they're Christian, especially this time, Jews or anyone that's atheists weren't really a thing back then. There were pagan religions. But if you have Romans, if you have Jews that are saying that he did exist, well, that lent a lot of weight because they have no motivation to actually say that Jesus existed. So we're going to start with those sources, so non-Christian sources to start. So we're going to start with Flavius Josephus. So he's one of the most, actually he might be the most prolific historian from the time of Jesus, right? A little bit after, so he was around from AD 37 to 100, so he was born after Jesus' crucifixion. But he wrote extensively on what was going on in Jerusalem at that time. And so, I already said that. So he didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So he was kind of an Orthodox Jew at that time who did not accept Jesus as Messiah. Why did it flip on me? Uh-oh. That's not good. I have no idea how that happened. I'm just going to restart it. That was weird. Play from... That's killing me. I have no idea how it did that. All right, I'm just going to have to do it this way. So most famous Jewish historian didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. He mentions Jesus in two passages, and this is going to be hard for me because I can't really read them from here. So the first passage that we have from Josephus is that he said this: "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if we can call him a man, and he was the Christ." Okay, so the thing with this passage is that he did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. He didn't believe Jesus as Messiah, none of that, and so he claims that he was the Christ. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing that's kind of telling us this might not be actually Josephus writing. And secondly, he says, if it be lawful to call him a man, right, which is also something that would be uncharacteristic of a first century Jew to say of someone like Jesus. They're not going to, because what that's basically implying is that, well, he has some level of deity, right, if it be lawful to call him a man, which the Jews vehemently denied at the time. He was not God. So what is believed that happened with this particular passage, it's likely that he did reference Jesus with this passage, but it most likely got in the hands of Christians that were trying to make a case for themselves that, well, Josephus agreed with me, and they kind of changed some of his language. And so we don't really know what he said in this particular passage. He most likely was referring to Jesus. We just don't know to what extent. It's the second passage that actually gives the most weight to the Christian argument that he affirmed the reality of Jesus, which is this one. I mean, he's actually talking about James, like Jesus' brother. But this is the quote. "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought there before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, who was James." Okay, so what's going on in this one is it's a more casual reference to Jesus, right? So he's not really talking about Jesus. He's talking about James's association with Jesus. And why that's important, so there's two things that he says here. He says, who was called the Christ, which would be characteristic of a first century Jew at that time who did not accept him as Messiah or God. Because he's not saying that he's calling him the Christ. He's saying that other people are calling him the Christ, right? So he's kind of distancing himself from that a little bit. And then it's association. So he's talking about James in his association with Jesus, right? Which is kind of odd because at this time, if we were talking about how people were referred to, I would have said, I am Michael, son of Dennis, right? Or, we would all be referred to in terms of our father usually. And so the fact that it's because that's the most notable person in our life is our father. And at this time, he's actually being referred to by his brother, which was very countercultural. So it must have meant that Jesus was someone that was rather noteworthy in order for Josephus to phrase it like that. So basic thing you want to get from that is that Josephus was affirming that Jesus was a real man and he existed, at the same time as the apostles, basically. So then we have Cornelius Tacitus. Let's see, so he was a Roman senator who wrote a history of the Roman Empire between AD 14 and 68. I believe he lived at a different time, yet he was AD 56 to 117. So he's kind of chronicling history that's before his life mostly of the Roman Empire. And so, that Jesus' crucifixion fits in that. So what he said, his main quote comes up in the context of Nero's persecution of Christians. Is anyone familiar with that? What was going on with Nero at the time? So around AD 64, there was a big fire that broke out in Rome, and Nero decided that he was going to blame the Christians for that. Right. So there was a major persecution of Christians because of that. So skeptics. Let's get the passage up there. So this is what was in the passage. Christus, the founder of the name, so being that Christians, so people were starting to refer themselves as Christians, and so Christus was referring to Christ, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. So that's a non-Christian source saying a lot right there. In that one sentence, what do we get from that? So first of all, he affirms that Jesus was a person, right? Christus, right? Was put to death. Oh, Jesus was also put to death, right? He doesn't say how, so we don't really necessarily get the crucifixion out of that, but he says he was put to death by Pontius Pilate, so which lines up with Scripture perfectly. And then because he had what's the word I'm looking for? Access to official documents at the time as a Roman senator, he probably knew everything about Pontius Pilate, which is where most of the detail is, which is that Pontius Pilate was a procurator of Judea during the reign of Tiberius, which also lines up with Scripture. This is like all of this stuff lines up with the Gospels very well. And so this really does lend, again, a lot of weight to the Bible, and that what it says is accurate and reliable. So some people, though, will argue that it can't be considered an independent evidence because Tacitus, we don't know Tacitus' source. But of course, Tacitus, as a senator, would have had access to those official documents. There's really no reason to doubt that. And of course, when you go back this far, you're not going to have a lot of those, you're going to have a lot of secondhand sources, and you're not going to be able to, when you're going back 2,000 years, a lot of that stuff's gone. So as far as history is concerned, it definitely at least affirms Jesus' existence, if not more than that. Then we have Pliny the Younger. So I know, funny names, like everyone had a funny name back then. I'm assuming there was a Pliny the Older. But so what he was a Roman official known for many letters to notable Romans at the time. So he wrote a lot of letters. And he actually referred to, he doesn't specifically refer to Jesus, but he refers to some of the activities of Christians going on at that time, which of course relies upon there actually being an object of worship, right? So he reported the worship activities of Christians to the emperor at the time, who was Emperor Trajan, and asked how to deal with them, right? And so this indicates that Christians had firsthand knowledge of who Jesus was and worshipped him accordingly. So they had an understanding of who Jesus, like what he represented, what he did, and because without knowing that, you wouldn't worship him, right? You have to know those kinds of details before you're going to do something like engage in worship. So again, just another building block to building the case that Jesus at least was a person who existed. Then we have Thallus. Okay, so Thallus is pretty much my favorite example, more because of how seemingly, what's the word I'm looking for? The details that he brings up are rather subtle to the crucifixion account, and he's not specifically referring to Jesus. He's referring to things that happened during Jesus' crucifixion, which a lot of times people will say, it's just supernatural mumbo-jumbo, it probably didn't happen, it's probably just, people, adding details later on. But this is what happened. So he's one of the first Gentile writers, so he actually predates the other guys we're talking about. So he's writing his account in 52 AD. The other guys, like Josephus, was born in 37, and then the other two were born after, like in 56 and 57. So this guy is one of the earliest ones, and he wrote a natural explanation for the darkness during Jesus' crucifixion. So you guys remember? So when Jesus was on the cross, there's this darkness that happens, and then the earthquake and all that. He actually tried to rationalize the darkness, which to me is just like, it just blows my mind that like this guy, I don't know if he was actually present for it, but obviously there were reports of this going on, at the time. And so he tries to explain away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun. So he says that, instead of like it being a supernatural darkness created by God, although what I will say, if at the time of the cross, there happens to be a solar eclipse happening over the crucifixion of Jerusalem at that exact, that is like God working. Right? But yeah, so to me, it's just one of the coolest little pieces of documentation that we have. Now, something to note, just because some people might look at this and question it because of it, we don't actually have Thallus' writing. Okay, we have Julius Africanus' writing about 150 to 200 years later in 221 AD. But he's making a reference to Thallus. So he's a Christian, and he's trying to make his case that what Thallus said was wrong, right? That it wasn't, a natural explanation. It was God that was, causing that darkness. And so there's no real reason to think that Thallus didn't write the natural explanation, because it doesn't really help Africanus' case. He's trying to make a rebuttal to that. So Yeah, it's only like with the case of Josephus, where he's kind of framing, Jesus as the Son of God, even though, Josephus almost certainly wouldn't have believed that. That, gives us reason to believe that it wasn't actually written that way. But because this really doesn't help Africanus' case at all, we don't really have any reason to doubt it. So, but yeah, just definitely my favorite little piece of documentation from that time. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through some of the non-Christian sources, let's talk about some of the Christian sources. So we have, first we have Clement of Rome, who I believe was a disciple of Paul, and he wrote the earliest letter outside of the New Testament in 96 AD. So, and some of our letters actually go back around that. Our Revelation, I think, was written around in the 90s. So, so he's writing around the same time as some of our actual biblical writings. So, and this is what he said. He addressed a dispute over leadership in the Church of Corinth, urging members to remember the works of Jesus. Okay, so obviously, if he's telling people to remember the works of Jesus, or the words, not works, words of Jesus, he's saying that Jesus existed, right? So you don't have words coming out of nowhere. So, so he's, again, affirming the reality that Jesus was a man. Then we have Ignatius of Antioch. So he's a disciple of John, who wrote a series of letters on his road to martyrdom. Okay, and again, so actually, I might as well put the other guy up here too. So both of these guys were disciples of John, and both of them were martyred. So I don't know if you know, but after the persecution of Nero started, it was not good for Christians all the way up to Constantine, who was 3rd or 4th century AD. So there was a couple centuries in there where there's a big persecution going on of Christians, and so both these guys were during that period of time. And these are just some of the things that they said on their way to martyrdom. So come fire, cross, battling with wild beasts, wrenching of bones, mangling of limbs, crushing of my whole body, cruel tortures of the devil, only let me get to Jesus Christ. Okay, so why would he have that kind of hope if Jesus wasn't a person who did what he said he did, right? So you're not going to go to those kinds of punishments if you didn't really believe that what was in the Bible was true. Okay? And the same goes for Polycarp. So what he said, Father, I bless you that you have deemed me worthy of this day and hour, that I might take a portion of the martyrs of the cup of Christ. Okay, so similar message, just no one would have that, motivation to do these just incredible acts of courage and standing up for Jesus. If they didn't really believe not only that he was a man, but that he was the God-man, right? You're not going to do those kinds of things unless you believe that. Okay, so here's another, so we're kind of shifting gears again. So did Jesus really claim to be God? So now we kind of established that it's pretty undeniable, and like I said, Dr. Bart Ehrman's, establishes that really no historian of antiquity says that Jesus was a myth. So, and it's really because they have all of those, non-Christian sources as well as Christian sources from that time that really point in that direction. So, but let's kind of shift a little bit and talk about, did Jesus really claim to be God? So, okay, so now that we say that he existed, did he actually say the things that are in the Bible? Okay, like claiming to be God, and people will say that he didn't claim to be God because he didn't. If you're reading the Bible itself, he doesn't come right out and say, "I am God." Those words never happen, but he does say he's God in a manner of speaking. But before we get to that, let's talk about moralistic therapeutic deism. And even that's kind of a big word, but it means something rather simple. And so each one of those words represents a different part of their belief. So moralistic, it's the belief that people should be good, right? And that's like a belief that they hold on to, that, and they don't mean it in a way that's different than the way that we mean it, because we were talking a couple weeks ago, like the concept of good is actually meaningless unless it's objective, right? Because anyone could just say, well, what's good to you is bad for me, what's bad for me is good for you. And they can kind of take that relativistic road of saying that. But these particular kinds of people actually believe a similar set of objective values that we do. A lot of them actually have a Christian background or value system. But unfortunately, it never solidified. They never really fully understood the doctrines and started to believe some interesting things. But this one actually doesn't conflict with our belief system. I mean, we believe that people should be good too. It's their second one that really deviates from Christian belief, which is that the goal of life is to feel good about oneself. So this is a big problem, because what is the goal of life? Actually, I'm going to put that up there, you guys. For a Christian, what's the goal? What are we here for? That's, yeah, right, witnessing. So witnessing to other people, evangelizing, that's definitely a huge thing. We can actually make that even broader, because when we tell people about Jesus, what's that doing? It's saving their, right, so saving them from eternal punishment, right? So that's good. I was thinking, a way that we can kind of think about the point of art is to glorify God, right? We just want to glorify God in everything that we do, and evangelism is part of that, right? It might be one of the biggest parts of that is glorifying God and bringing other people into that, right? So, like Carolyn said, so we want to save them so that they can engage in this lifestyle of worship as well. And so, if really the point of life is to glorify God, how can someone who believes this fail in that way? Does that ever create a problem where, so if I believe that the goal of life is for me to feel good, what are some situations in which I'm probably not going to glorify God? Might not be phrasing that well. So in a situation like if someone were to, if you're in a situation that kind of makes you uncomfortable, that doesn't make you feel good, right? A lot of times when we're evangelizing, let's go with what Caitlin said. Doesn't that make us uncomfortable sometimes? Like to go out like on a prayer walk and just like, you don't know who's going to open that door. It could be someone with a gun. Like, I don't know. So you could be put in, now of course that's an extreme circumstance, but even if it's, but their words might feel like a gun, right? It might feel like bullets coming at you. If they're someone who's very staunchly against Christianity or something, it can hurt. They can say, you just believe in a bunch of hogwash. It's, I don't know how you guys can possibly believe that. You're also stupid and bigoted and whatever. And that hurts, right? That certainly doesn't feel good. And I think it can really hinder our glorification of God if we think that the whole purpose of life is for us to feel good. And that's kind of a big conflict with people that believe in moralistic therapeutic deism. And then the last one, obviously we agree with that. It's a phenomenon apparently, at least when this book was written, which was I think like 2017, it was really popular amongst teenagers because I feel like it was probably teenagers that were somewhat nominal Christians. They were born into a Christian family who maybe went to church occasionally, but never really fully understood what Christianity was. And so they kind of understand, like, okay, I want to be good because Jesus is good, but they don't really even know what that entails, and they start to believe these rather interesting things. And that's kind of part of it. Because apparently it's very, and now it's, of course, we're looking more into younger adults, early 20s. That's kind of where this is still more popular. But of course, if you didn't grow up in a Christian household at all, this probably wouldn't seem that appealing to you because you have no reason to believe that God exists, or even, I think moral relativism is more reigns in that kind of section of society. And so their concept of good is not objective in any way. Any questions on anything I've said so far, or comments? Good. All right. So let's talk about Jesus claiming to be God, because that's actually a big thing that moralistic therapeutic deists just don't believe, right? So they believe that God exists, but they don't believe that Jesus is God. That connection was never made. And so some of them might actually have some level of knowledge. They might know, well, Jesus never says he's God in the Bible. He never, goes to the Pharisees and says, I am God. And which I said is true. When we look at the actual scriptures, he doesn't do that. But he does other things. So the name given by God for himself in the Old Testament is Yahweh. Okay, so that's how he's referred to himself. So when you see in the Bible, when you're reading your Old Testament and you see Lord in caps, that's in Hebrew, that's Yahweh. So it's because they don't have vowels, so it's Yahweh is kind of how it's pronounced. But it's essentially Yahweh. That's what it is. And anyone who claims to be Yahweh, of course, claims to be God, right? Because that's God's name for himself. So if you're claiming to be Yahweh, you are claiming to be God. And now, this is what Jesus does in John 8:58. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And you're all probably looking at me and like, I don't see Yahweh in that statement. Which you don't, right? He doesn't say, before Abraham was, I am Yahweh. But this is a direct reference. Does anyone know like what's going on with this? Have anyone heard this one before? So you kind of know how he's talking about God here. Do you want to share it or?
You can go ahead. I don't know how to explain it.
Okay. No, that's totally cool. But so what's going on here? He's actually referring to Exodus 3:14. Actually, you could have just read off my slides there. That's essentially what I'm doing anyway. So Moses asks God his name, and God responds, "I am that I am." Right, and actually because what he's doing here is he's saying to God, "Well, what should I tell to the people your name is?" And he says, tell him that I am sent you. And that's what he says. And then, of course, a couple verses later in John 3:16, it's such a famous verse. In Exodus 3:16, he says, he refers to himself as the Lord again, as Yahweh. So Yahweh is I am. So they're both the same. And Jesus is using that to basically troll the Pharisees. He says, before Abraham was, I am. And that's kind of a dual reference to Exodus 3:14 as well as his eternality. Right, so it kind of sounds like this grammatically incorrect statement, right? Before Abraham was, I am. It sounds grammatically incorrect. But when he says I am, he means it's not like I was before Abraham. I am before Abraham. I am now, and I will always be. Right? That's kind of what that I am statement is really saying. So it's a reference to his eternality as well as his deity. So it's he's kind of killing two birds with one stone with that statement. So Jesus claimed to be Yahweh in that moment. Jesus also claimed to have the same rights as God, which all of the Jews at this time understood. Especially the Pharisees. They were very well aware of the rights that only belonged to God, and so there were several of them. So we're going to talk about a few of them. The right to forgive sins was one of the bigger ones, right? So anyone remember that scene from that story from the Bible where Jesus heals the paralytic? Right, and he says to him, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees just blow up into a tizzy because only God can forgive sins. And of course, Jesus said something to the effect of like, well, words are meaningless, but if I tell you get up and walk, that's the real evidence, right? And that's what happened in that situation is Jesus told him to get up and walk, which is the evidence that he actually had the right to forgive sins. But what's more importantly, Jesus claimed to have the right to forgive sins, which tells us that he's making a claim to deity in that moment. Okay? So another one is the right to raise and judge the dead. All of the Pharisees from this time, all the Jewish elite understood that meant if you were saying that you had the right to raise and judge the dead, you were claiming deity, which Jesus did. He says, "For the Father has given me the authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." He's actually doing a couple things there, which we're going to talk about. He refers to himself as the Son of Man, and he says he has the authority to execute judgment, which are actually two separate claims there. The right to execute judgment is a claim to deity. The Son of Man is a reference to his messiahship, which I didn't know this until relatively recently. They're two different things. When he says that he's the Messiah, he's not actually referring to himself as God, because the Jews at the time didn't understand that the Messiah was God. We understand. Like, how many? If I say Messiah, what do you guys think? God, right? Jesus, God, all the same thing. Which is, I had the same idea too. So we just talked about that. So the right to be honored like God too. So this is also a thing that Jesus did. This is what he said in John 5:23. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. So he's in this statement, he's equating the Son with the Father and saying they both have the right to be honored. And again, it's just another claim to deity. So we're just kind of going through all these different, claims that Jesus had the same rights as God through his own words, right? So Jesus also claimed to be the Messiah, right? So I said that these are two separate entities that actually are one, right? So and that was one of the big revelations with Jesus is that the Messiah was God, right? Which is not what they were expecting, but that's what happened. And so the Messiah is the anointed one or the chosen one. So that's what it means. It's just a simple definition of what the Messiah is. It's also Christ is just the Greek version of that. So when people say Christ, it means Messiah. It's just different languages. And Isaiah 9:6 calls the Messiah mighty God. Okay, we probably are familiar with that verse where Prince of Peace, Wonderful Counselor, a child is born. It's that verse from Isaiah, and it refers to the Messiah as mighty God. Now, something to be careful with this verse is that Jews do not accept that verse as being messianic. Okay, to them it's talking about another king, which we don't have to get into the weeds with that, Hezekiah, is how they interpret that. They don't think that it's actually talking about Jesus. And so this isn't really going to help, make the case to Jews that Jesus is the Messiah or that Jesus is God, because they don't accept that this verse is messianic. However, what Jesus did do is he refers to himself as the Son of Man over and over and over and over again. So Daniel refers to the Messiah as the Son of Man in his book. And that was Jesus' preferred title for himself. If you're reading Matthew, if you're reading any of the Gospels, Son of Man is something that he repeatedly refers to himself as, which was a messianic claim. So if he was going up to a Pharisee and he calls himself the Son of Man, they're thinking Messiah. That's what they're thinking in their head. I already said that. So when Caiaphas asked Jesus if he is the Son of God, he asked this. Hold on, I can't read this. He asked this because it was known that Jesus was making claims to deity. So this wasn't because, like I said, because Jesus, he wasn't asking him if he was the Son of God because he was calling himself the Son of Man, right? To the Jews, those are two separate things. Son of Man was Messiah. Son of God, well, that would be a claim to deity, right? But since over this whole 3-year ministry, Jesus kept making these claims to deity, that's why he's asking him, are you the Son of God? Because that's basically what he was saying in all of his claims to deity before that. And this epic moment in Matthew, so he said in response, when he's on trial and he's asked if he's the Son of God, he says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Father and coming in the clouds of heaven." And that's Mark. Actually, that's Mark 14:61. So what he's doing in this final statement is he's saying he's both, right? He says that I am, and you will see the Son of Man, you will see the Messiah, seated at the right hand of the Father and coming in the clouds of heaven. That is a definite claim to deity. People can't come from the clouds of heaven. And of course, this is when they tear their clothes and they condemn him to die. And that's another evidence that they understood what he was saying, right? So the Pharisees understood that he was making claims to deity and messiahship in that moment, which is why they went crazy. And so when people say that Jesus didn't actually claim to be the Messiah or God, well, you just said, well, why did they tear their robes? They didn't tear their robes because, he said that, he didn't like Swiss cheese. So Jesus also claimed his words had authority. So this is just another way that he makes, making his claim to deity. So, if I were to say, you've heard that it was said, but really, no one's going to take me seriously because my words don't have authority. But because they saw his works, they saw his miracles, they saw his fulfillment of prophecy, they saw everything that he could do to give evidence that he was God, they believed him, right? And that's why he could make these kinds of claims. So that's what he would do. So he would make these he would give clarity on the law, which was something that no one could really do. They could make interpretations, but he was claiming that he actually understood it in the way that God had intended, more so than just a Pharisaical approach. So he challenged the prevailing view of the scriptures and claimed the authority to declare its full meaning. He also claimed not to change the law, but people's understanding of it. So I had to kind of really think through this a little bit. So this is what Jesus says. He says, "Until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota will pass away from the law." Okay, so did some things change after Jesus came with the law? Like what? Can you just think of anything that maybe an Orthodox Jew might hold to today that we don't? That's the big one, right? A lot of the ones that we think about, like wheat, pig, they don't. Even some interesting ones, like they can't eat cheese and meat at the same time. There were a lot of clothes regulations too that they had to abide by. Their hand washing was a big one, right? So if you didn't wash your hands before you eat, you ate with defiled hands. So there were all these ceremonial things that you'd have to do, and of course those changed. But does that mean that the law changed? Because that's what I had to really think through, was Jesus didn't actually change the law. What did he do? How does he usually put it? He didn't change it, he did what? Think of it? Fulfill, right? He fulfilled the law. So that's really what he did. And what was he fulfilling? So when they were doing these acts, why did they have to do them? Why did they have to avoid certain foods? Why did they have to dress a certain way? Any ideas on that? It's okay if you don't know, because
To be more pure.
Yes, it's exactly, yes. So it was all about purity, right? And so what happened, when Jesus went to the cross? How do we get pure? Right. So when Jesus, John, welcome.
Jesus,
Did you? Was that an answer to the question?
I think if I didn't ask the question, I'll answer Jesus.
There you go. Yeah, actually, you were right. That's like Sunday School 101. If you're ever unsure about the answer, just say Jesus. That's funny. But yeah, no. So we're purified by Jesus' blood on the cross, right? So when all those ceremonial laws, if we're going to be in the presence of God, we do not have to do ceremonial laws because that was covered by Jesus, right? So that's how he fulfilled that. And what happens? So what happens once we believe? Does anyone how do we access God? Or what happens? What happens to our relationship with God? So instead of going to the temple, right? So at the time of the Jews, they would, in order to be in the presence of God, they would have to make sure they were pure, and then they could go to the temple. How do we get into the presence of God? Prayer. Yep. Yeah. That's kind of how that relationship is made, like how we make contact in that way. But God actually dwells within us through the Holy Spirit, right? So we are the temple that He exists within. And so really it's when Jesus kind of purifies us, it actually makes it so that we don't actually have to do those ceremonial things to come into His presence because of what Jesus did. So Jesus is the source of our purity, not any of our works, which is how that became fulfilled. So any questions on that? It's kind of a heady thing, which is why I had to think through it. But all right. So next we have he made the same claim about his own words, right? So not only was it the law that won't pass away, but his words won't pass away either. Remember that from where was it? Matthew 5:18? Nope, that's the other one. Matthew 24:35. So heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So he's claiming that his words, just like the law, also will never pass away. So he's equating his words with the law, which again, who wrote the law? God, right? So it's just another claim to deity. So that's just kind of what we're running through, is just all these different ways that Jesus made these claims to be God. And he also asserted that he has all authority, and so we know that from this verse down here in Matthew 28. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. You can't be a man and have that kind of authority. You have to be God if you're going to have all authority in that way. So he's just over and over again, he's making these claims that only God can possibly make. Which really, to me, because of how frequent they are, they're the most convincing evidences that he is claiming to be God, even more so than the I am statement, because he doesn't really do a whole lot of those. He does a lot of the Son of Man, claims. But as far as the overt claims to be God, really the I am one is the big one. But then he makes all these claims to have the same rights and authorities as God, and that's really the big one that points us in that direction. Finally, Jesus also accepted worship and prayer. So, which, only God can do those things, right? So, the Old Testament forbid worship to anyone except God. Now, and I was kind of I think this is a discussion that some of you might have been present for that one, where we were talking about why isn't it okay for us to accept worship? Anyone remember? Was anyone in that class? So when one man worships another man, like a king or something. So we all have equal value, right? We're all made in God's image, and so none of us inherently have more spiritual value, put it that way. I mean, some of us might make more money or we might have more man-made type value stuff. But as far as spiritual value, we are all equal, right? We are all, God's children, or we are all made in the image of God. And so none of us have inherently more worship than another. But God does, right? God. It's appropriate for us to worship God, and this is something that God establishes, and that's why it's not really okay to worship anyone but God. And there's multiple occasions where Jesus didn't rebuke those who worshipped him. And so I just have some examples up here. So we have the leper from Matthew 8:2. We have a ruler, which is Jairus, when his daughter died. We have the Syrophoenician woman who had a possessed daughter, a demon-possessed daughter. And we have the mother of James and John, Salome, that were all kneeling before Jesus. And that sign of kneeling was a sign of worship, right? And Jesus never rebuked them for doing that. He accepted that. And so if you're going to accept worship, you better be prepared to also say that you're God at the same time. So, and he also claimed that he could answer prayers and be a unique conduit to God, all right? So I can't answer a prayer, right? I can pray for you, right, to God, but I can't answer a prayer. Only God can do that. And Jesus claimed that he had that ability. So whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. And you may ask for anything in my name, and I will do it. Okay, so if I said that, I'd be a liar. But Jesus meant that as being someone that could actually answer prayer. So it's just another claim to deity. Did Jesus' followers believe that he was God? That's another thing that people will sometimes say, is that, well, Jesus' followers didn't actually believe that he was God, which, depending on your perspective, might be true. So skeptics argue that Jesus' miracles do not confirm his divinity. And they say that there could be natural explanations, or he might have been some sort of representative of God, right? And he wasn't God himself, but he was like a Moses figure, right? That could do miracles on behalf of God. And these are the kinds of things that they'll say. So the thing is, though, if the disciples didn't believe that Jesus was God, we would have little reason to, because how do we even know Jesus existed? Yeah, all of our documentation comes from the apostles, right? So that's one of the qualifications. If we're going to accept a writing as something that can go into the canon of Scripture, one of the big ones was that it had to be apostolic. And Jesus himself didn't write any of it. These were all the apostles writing Jesus' words, or through prophecy. So, like Paul, for example, would prophetically write as one of his apostles. So, let's talk about that. So, what did the disciples actually believe about Jesus? And so we're gonna talk about two different times. So we have during Jesus' life, and then we have after Jesus' death and resurrection. Because depending on the time that you're looking at, they apparently believe different things. So the disciples during Jesus' life, from all available evidence, were not completely certain about who Jesus was. They thought that maybe he was the Messiah, but we're not really sure what that means. And so let's kind of talk about that. So the big verse that comes into my head when I think of like, well, what did the disciples think, was Mark 8:29. When Jesus asked them who he was, Peter makes this wonderful claim: "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," right? And so that seems like he has a pretty good idea of who Jesus was. But of course, what happens, not long after that, is Jesus then starts to tell him about what's going to happen to him, how he's going to be betrayed by the elders, and he's going to be crucified, and he's going to be raised in 3 days. And Peter's like, "No, never, heaven forbid!" And then Jesus calls him Satan. So, so what's going on there is that Peter has a certain idea of who the Messiah is supposed to be, who the Christ is supposed to be. Which was a misunderstanding of who Jesus knew that the Messiah was, right? So the Messiah was supposed to be the one to forgive sins, and the only way that could do that is if he went to the cross, which that was just way off of Peter's radar at the time. So he had a misconception about who Jesus was. He didn't really understand exactly who he was, even though he accepted that he was the Christ. So in John 14:8, this is another example of one of the disciples that, again, just missed the mark. So Philip says, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us." And, hold on, where is it? So Jesus rebukes him, saying that whoever has seen me has seen the Father, right? So he's thinking that Jesus is different than the Father, like, in the sense that they're both not God. And Jesus kind of rebukes him, saying that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? So you've seen God. And so again, not understanding that he is the deity that he claims to be. In John 2:22, the disciples were confused when Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, it actually says in John 2:22 that they understood this after he was raised from the dead, right? But at the time, they were like, when's the temple going to be destroyed? Which it was destroyed in 70 AD. But that was not what Jesus was referring to in this moment. He was talking about his crucifixion and raising it up 3 days later. But it says in Scripture that they had no idea what was meant by that at the time. So I think I covered all that. But after Jesus' resurrection, big difference. Okay, so we have Thomas proclaiming that Jesus was God after seeing him risen, right? So after he sees the holes in his hands and the holes in his side, he says, "My Lord and my God." He understood both. He understood him as God and his Lord, which was not something that they really conceptualized prior to that. We have Paul and John both referring to Jesus as the creator. So we have John in his book. So this is like the book of John, which is the very famous opening. So where he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things are made through him." At that point in the scripture, you don't really know what he's referring to. But then a little bit later, he says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, which is obviously a reference to Jesus. So we have John here saying that Jesus was the creator of everything. We also have Paul making that same claim in Colossians 1:15. By him all things were created on heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. So, unless you're God, you're not going to be able to create the cosmos. So we have both Paul and John referring to him as God. The disciples and Paul viewed Jesus as the forgiver of sins, right? So we have Acts 5:31, where it says that God exalted him at his right hand to give repentance for Israel and forgiveness of sins. And that was something that Peter said in the book of Acts. So they understood that he was the forgiver of sins, which again is only something God can do. And then after the resurrection, they were willing to die for the gospel. So that kind of is what really wraps all of this up, because anyone can lie, right? They can just be using this for self-serving reasons, right? They can just be claiming that Jesus was the creator so that they could get money or whatever. But not a single one of them recanted of their claim. They all went to horrific deaths. There was only one of them didn't get martyred, and that was John. He was exiled to Patmos, but the rest of them died very gruesome deaths, and none of them ever recanted because of what they believed, which is martyrs make poor liars. That's just why did Jesus need to die for our sins? Okay, this is another way that people really misconstrue our belief system. So if it is cruel for a pagan tribe to toss an innocent person into a volcano to appease the volcano god, why is it okay for Christians to celebrate the sacrifice of Jesus to appease their God? Okay, this is kind of a way that people will kind of almost equate Christian worship to human sacrifice as something that it's like an Aztec, pagan type of practice. And if what's going on here is they're missing a couple of details. So I think the way I worded it in my notes was the way that they actually phrase it sometimes. Why would we celebrate an innocent man being crucified to appease the Christian God? And that kind of says a big problem right there. So why would we celebrate an innocent man? Okay, of course, Jesus wasn't just a man, right? Jesus was also God. And so they're kind of missing that detail in there. And it's also missing a big doctrinal concept, which is what this is, right? So sin. So the whole reason, if sin didn't exist, Jesus wouldn't have had to do what he did, right? If we didn't sin, Jesus doesn't have to do that. So we have to kind of understand what sin is if we're going to be able to conceptualize what was going on with the cross. So sin, and this is a Webster definition. I think it's not a very good Christian definition, but here we go. An immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. The only reason it says considered to be a transgression against divine law is because it's not written by a Christian. It's an immoral act that is a transgression against divine law. That's what sin is. So if God doesn't exist, the concept of sin is meaningless. So some of you might remember from a few sessions ago where, so if we have a divine law, we have to have a divine lawgiver, right? So laws here on earth are meaningless if there's not police to enforce it, if we don't have a government, if we don't have people to write the laws and also enforce them, to judges to adjudicate on them. If we don't have those kinds of bodies, what meaning do laws have? No one's going to follow them, right? Because there's no reason to think that they're going to be followed up on. And the same would go for sin, right? So if sin is a divine law, if there's no divine lawgiver, then there's no reason to follow it, right? So when we steal, when we murder, when we do all those things, and we all kind of know that something wrong has happened, which again points to this tacit understanding that there must be someone there running the show. So if God doesn't exist, the concept of sin is meaningless. And what's going on with sin, of course, and I'm kind of stating the obvious with this, but we're not physically dead when we sin, right? So it's not like when I sin, I just drop dead, but we are spiritually dead. And it's actually a lot more serious than people, lead on. So when I die here, the reason why that actually has, what's the word I'm looking for? the reason why that can be so awful is because it depends on where I'm going, right? So if I'm going to heaven, death here isn't really all that bad of a thing. We're transitioning into something that's actually far better. But there's this understanding that if whether you believe in what Christians believe, that you go to, that it's contingent upon belief in Jesus, or whether you believe what a lot of other religions believe, which is like you have to have a certain number of works, there is this possibility of hell too. And that's really the big problem that needs a solution, is that sin makes it so that we're separated from God forever. And so it's a problem that needs a very drastic solution. And if it's not solved in a certain way, the consequences are extreme for us, right? And so we need to somehow rectify that. And so when people say that it's like human sacrifice, they're kind of ignoring this idea that it's saving us from something that is far worse than anything that we can imagine. And so we have God as just. Any questions on anything that I've said so far? Pretty good? Okay. So Richard Dawkins says this: so if God wanted to forgive our sins, why not forgive them without having himself tortured and executed in payment? So what do you guys think of that statement? Why couldn't it just be that way?
We might be stupid humans and not get it.
What's that?
We might just be stupid humans and not understand it without seeing anything.
Understand what?
Like, if God just did declare, hey, we were all forgiven, and we weren't listening anyway to half the things he said, so having a visual representation.
Kind of helps us to understand that what we did was wrong, you mean?
Yeah, I'd say the burning bush, he gave us most of the thought. But if God just spoke from heaven, there'd be a lot of people here that probably wouldn't hear it.
Get it, yeah, hear it or get it. Okay, that's a possibility, right? Does God have to punish? What do you think? What if I put it in a different way? What if I said someone murdered their child? Very extreme circumstance. And the judge said, you know what? I can tell you're sorry. I'll forgive you. And the guy gets off the hook and nothing happens. Is that just? No, right? And so that's what's going on with this. There must be, in order for it to be just, the punishment has to be fulfilled. It has to be enacted in some way. And so that's why this idea really fails, because it's saying that we can transgress, we can commit crimes without any punishment, right? So because that's what sin is. Sin is a crime against God. So God is a God of love and justice, and this is really the predicament. So God is the good judge. We are the breakers of his good law, and the penalty for breaking the good law is death, right? So the wages of sin is death. And so we are all, going to experience death if we don't have some way out, right? We need a way out of this. And the way out is just so mind-blowing, but it's like something that only God can really think of, because this is not made by a man. So God chose to justly forgive in a way that it was both just, right? The punishment was enacted, but somehow the transgressors were let off, right? And there's only one way that this could possibly happen, and God chose to do it that way. God is both the judge and the offended party, right? So let's take that. So the situation I gave before, but changed a little bit. Actually, I'm going to take the murder part out of it. I'm going to make it stealing. So we have a judge, right? Who I stole his Corvette. I stole his Corvette, and I really wanted it. And so what the judge does in this situation is he decides, you know what? I can tell that he's repentant. I can tell he's really sorry. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay his fines, and I'm going to serve his jail sentence. And I'm also going to set that sentence too, because I'm the judge, and I can call those shots. And that is what God does when he forgives us of our sin. He actually takes it for us. And I don't think that situation has ever happened in the human realm, where you've had a judge that was inflicted, some sort of major injury upon him, and then he served this. It's just unthinkable to us. But that's what our God did for us because of his love. So he absolved humanity by paying the price of their sin himself. And Christians view this, obviously, as an amazing act of love, not divine child abuse. So this is how some people will sometimes put that. Is they'll say, well, God was just abusing his son on the cross. But of course, that's a failure to understand the Trinity, right? Was it God really abusing his son? Or was God going to the cross himself? Jesus is God, right? So they're two different persons of the one being of God. So that's really what was going on. So it's just a misunderstanding of who Jesus was when they say that it was divine child abuse. Additionally, the Father and the Son were working. It's not like Jesus was unwilling when he was going to the cross. We have a number of things that he said to affirm that he was very well aware of what he was going to do, as much as he didn't want to do it. Right. So we have the Garden of Gethsemane. He's sweating blood, but he knew that this was the only way out for us. And so he says, what does he say? No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. This charge I have received from my Father. He's referring to his life in that moment. So both Jesus and the Father were working together to accomplish salvation. And there's just one more thing. So when people do kind of try to misconstrue God's amazing act of love on the cross as something less than that, as some sort of child abuse or some sort of pagan ritual or something. There's just something, first of all, they don't understand their sin, but there's also just this very ungracious attitude, I feel like. This is the one way out that you were given because of something you did, right? We are the transgressors, not God. And we're somehow reframing our transgressions and imposing them back on God when we're making those kinds of claims. And so, I just kind of felt like I had to put that in there. But okay, so why blood sacrifice makes it all better? And it's kind of just a recapitulation of what we already said. So, God is a God of love and justice. Humans are sinful. Sin is a real and serious problem. So when we think of sin as being anything like, when we think of lying as well, that's not really a bad sin. God unfortunately does think of it as bad sin. He can't understand our lying. It's all extremely bad to him, but because we identify it, we don't see it as bad as we should. And they all have the same result. The penalty of sin is death. That's the result. And God took the penalty upon himself so that we wouldn't have to. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you got something out of it. Feel free to, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know.